The call to war. The Galactic Council's chamber buzzed with urgency as the holographic image of a crumbling colony filled the room. The Xarnix horde, a monstrous hive-mind species, had begun their invasion, leaving planets in ruin. Super soldiers from advanced civilizations were called into action. Each was equipped with the most advanced technology. Machines designed to fight, adapt, and win. It was a battle for survival, and every species had to send their best. Far away on Earth, in a quiet farming village, Joe Hargrove sat by the radio in his modest wooden home. The announcement of the invasion played on loop, urging all able-bodied beings to enlist. Joe, a man of simple means, lived a life of routine. He spent his days tending to crops and his nights fixing tools. His neighbors dismissed him as an unremarkable man. "This isn't our fight," one villager said, shaking his head. "Earth is too far for the Xarnix to care about." But Joe thought differently. His hands tightened around a mug of coffee as he listened to the broadcast. He looked out at the fields stretching beyond his house, golden under the fading sun. He had worked hard for everything he had, and he couldn't stand the thought of anyone taking it away. Not aliens, not anyone. When the recruiter's shuttle landed in the village square, the locals gathered out of curiosity. They stared in awe as the Galactic officer, dressed in sleek armor, called for volunteers. Most shook their heads and walked away, muttering about how Earth wasn't ready for intergalactic war. Joe stepped forward. His neighbors burst into laughter when they saw him approach the shuttle carrying nothing but an old pitchfork slung over his shoulder. "You can't be serious, Joe," one of them said, chuckling. "You think you're gonna fight aliens with a pitchfork?" Joe shrugged, his weathered face calm. "Sometimes, you don't need fancy tools to get the job done." The officer gave him a long look, clearly unimpressed. "We need warriors, not farmers." Joe didn't flinch. "You need people who know how to survive. That's me." The officer, perhaps out of desperation, allowed Joe to board. The other villagers watched as the shuttle rose into the sky, leaving their quiet world behind. Joe sat quietly in his seat, his pitchfork resting against his knee. He could feel the stares of the other recruits, tough men and women from Earth's cities who came armed with knives, guns, and whatever weapons they could scavenge. "Hey, old man," a young recruit sneered. "That thing a weapon or a gardening tool?" Joe smiled faintly but said nothing. As the shuttle soared through space, Joe's mind wandered. He wasn't sure why he felt so strongly about joining this fight. Perhaps it was stubbornness. Perhaps it was the memory of his late father telling him, "Son, you don't let anyone or anything take what's yours." When the shuttle docked at the war camp, Joe stepped out into a bustling scene. Hundreds of soldiers marched, polished and armed to the teeth. Droids zipped past, carrying supplies, and galactic commanders barked orders. It was a world so far removed from Joe's quiet farm that he couldn't help but feel out of place. As he wandered the camp, the mockery continued. Super soldiers in power armor smirked at him, their weapons gleaming under the camp's artificial lights. "What's that? A magic fork?" one of them joked, laughing loudly. Joe ignored them. He spent the evening sharpening the metal tips of his pitchfork, his hands steady and precise. He didn't care about the jokes. He had faced droughts, storms, and even wild beasts back home. This was no different, he told himself. Later that night, Joe overheard two officers talking in hushed tones. "The Xarnix are unstoppable," one said. "Their hive mind makes them immune to fear and pain. Our best tech can't even slow them down." Joe paused, his sharpening stone hovering midair. A faint memory stirred in his mind. His grandfather's stories about a strange metal passed down in their family, something that disrupted things it touched. The pitchfork wasn't just a tool, it was a relic. He didn't fully understand it, but something about this war felt like fate. As the officers moved away, Joe gripped the pitchfork tighter. He didn't know what the days ahead would bring, but one thing was certain. The Xarnix wouldn't know what hit them. The night was quiet as Joe prepared for the battle to come. The doubts, The mockery and the fear didn't bother him. He had made his choice, and he would see it through. Hook. Why does Joe believe his pitchfork holds the key to defeating the unstoppable Xarnix? Arrival at the warfront. The Galactic transport ship roared through space, its hull gleaming under distant starlight. Inside, recruits sat in tense silence. The hum of engines was broken only by the occasional chatter of eager soldiers comparing their weapons. Joe Hargrove, however, sat apart from the group, his pitchfork resting against the wall beside him. "Still can't believe they let a farmer on board," muttered a recruit wearing patched armor. "Maybe he's got some secret weapon hidden in that fork of his," another joked, nudging his friend. Joe didn't respond. He leaned back in his seat, his face calm but his eyes watchful. The ridicule didn't bother him. He had seen far worse than insults in his time. Storms that ruined entire harvests, wolves that attacked his livestock, and neighbors who abandoned him during hard times. Surviving hardship was part of who he was, and this battlefield would be no different. When the transport finally landed on the warfront, the ramp opened to chaos. The base was a hive of activity, with soldiers and machines moving in a coordinated dance of preparation. Massive walkers stomped across the metal-plated ground, their mechanical limbs carrying supplies to the front lines. Drones zipped through the air, scanning for any signs of the enemy. Joe stepped off the transport, pitchfork in hand, and surveyed the scene. Everywhere he looked, soldiers were gearing up with advanced weapons, plasma cannons, energy shields, and sleek suits of armor that glowed faintly in the dim light. "Welcome to the war zone," said an officer, barely sparing Joe a glance. "Try not to die too quickly, old man." The officer moved on, leaving Joe to navigate the camp. As he walked, the stares and whispers followed him. Most of the recruits found their assigned squads quickly, eager to join the action. Joe, however, wandered to the edge of the camp, drawn by a strange noise. There, away from the hustle of the main base, a group of battle droids was undergoing repairs. Sparks flew as engineers worked tirelessly, their tools clinking against metal. Joe's eyes narrowed as he noticed something peculiar. Every droid had the same damage pattern, deep, jagged slashes that glowed faintly with an unnatural energy. "That's Xarnix venom," said a gruff voice behind him. Joe turned to see a veteran soldier, his armor scratched and dented from countless battles. "It's not just poison. It messes with circuits, disrupts signals. These tin cans don't stand a chance against it." Joe studied the slashes, his mind turning. The Xarnix were more than just a hive mind. They were designed to exploit weakness, to tear apart even the strongest defenses. "Seems like you're fighting the wrong way," Joe said quietly. The veteran snorted. "And what would you know, farmer? Got some secret farming technique to stop an alien horde." Joe shrugged, his hand brushing the handle of his pitchfork. "Sometimes it's not about fighting harder. It's about fighting smarter." The veteran scoffed and walked away, leaving Joe alone with his thoughts. That night, as darkness fell over the camp, Joe found himself at the edge of the perimeter. Beyond the barricades lay the wasteland, a barren expanse of cracked earth and jagged rocks, illuminated by the eerie glow of distant stars. Somewhere out there, the Xarnix waited. Joe closed his eyes, letting the cool night air wash over him. He gripped the pitchfork tightly, feeling its familiar weight in his hands. It wasn't just a tool. It was a symbol of everything he had fought for, everything he was willing to protect. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet trembled. A low, guttural hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Soldiers scrambled to their posts, alarms blaring through the camp. "They're here," someone shouted. Joe stood his ground as the first wave of Xarnix appeared on the horizon. They moved like a shadowy tide, their forms shifting and blending into the darkness. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and their screeches pierced the air like nails on glass. Super soldiers in power armor rushed forward, their weapons blazing. Plasma bolts lit up the battlefield, cutting through the night like fireworks. But the Xarnix moved as one, dodging and weaving with terrifying precision. Joe watched as the soldiers fought valiantly, but without coordination. They relied too much on their technology, too little on their instincts. He could see the panic in their movements, the cracks in their strategies. A Xarnix drone broke through the line, charging straight for Joe. The soldiers nearby shouted warnings, but Joe didn't flinch. As the creature lunged, Joe raised his pitchfork and drove it into the drone's chest. For a moment, the battlefield seemed to freeze. The Xarnix screeched, its body convulsing violently as an electric pulse rippled through it. Then, with a final cry, it collapsed to the ground, its glowing eyes dimming. The nearby soldiers stared in shock. What just happened? One of them stammered. Joe pulled his pitchfork free, its tines glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. "It doesn't like this," he said simply, his voice calm. The soldiers exchanged nervous glances, their earlier mockery forgotten. The pitchfork, once a symbol of ridicule, now carried an undeniable power. As the Xarnix regrouped for another attack, Joe tightened his grip on the pitchfork and stepped forward. He wasn't just a farmer anymore. He was a fighter, and the battlefield was his new field to plow. Hook. How is Joe's pitchfork disrupting the Xarnix, and will his unique approach inspire the soldiers to fight smarter? The first battle. The battlefield was chaos. Plasma bolts streaked through the air, lighting up the darkness in bursts of fiery orange and blue. Soldiers in power armor clashed with Xarnix drones, their weapons creating deafening blasts that barely slowed the enemy. The Xarnix moved like a tide, fast, coordinated, and relentless. Each drone seemed to anticipate the next move, as if they shared a single mind. Joe Hargrove stood at the edge of the battle, his pitchfork glowing faintly in his hands. He watched as the super soldiers charged ahead, their advanced tech failing to keep pace with the enemy's unity. For all their training and firepower, the Galactic forces were falling apart under the Xarnix's calculated onslaught. Nearby, a squad of soldiers was cornered by a swarm of drones. Their captain barked orders, but the Xarnix were too fast. Joe didn't hesitate. He gripped his pitchfork tightly and ran toward the fray, his boots kicking up dust as he closed the distance. "Fall back," the captain shouted at Joe. "You're not equipped for this." Joe ignored him. As the first drone lunged, its sharp claws glinting in the light, Joe sidestepped with surprising speed. He drove his pitchfork into the drone's chest, and a ripple of energy burst from the impact. The drone convulsed, its glowing eyes flickering before it collapsed to the ground. The other drones paused, their heads snapping toward Joe in unison. For a moment, the battlefield seemed to hold its breath. What did you do?" the captain stammered, staring at the fallen drone. Joe pulled the pitchfork free and glanced at the weapon. The faint glow along its tines pulsed steadily, as if responding to the Xarnix energy. "This old thing doesn't just move hay," Joe said simply. The drones screeched and charged, their movements erratic, almost desperate. Joe stood his ground, his weathered hands gripping the pitchfork like it was an extension of himself. Each thrust disrupted the Xarnix, sending waves of distortion through their ranks. The soldiers, emboldened by Joe's success, began to rally around him. They formed a defensive line, using their weapons to hold off the drones while Joe disrupted their cohesion. One soldier, a young woman with a cracked visor, shouted, "It's like they're afraid of him." "They're not just afraid," Joe said, his voice calm even as he drove the pitchfork into another drone. "This thing messes with their connection. They can't think straight when it's near." The realization spread quickly through the ranks. The Xarnix, for all their terrifying power, relied on their hive mind connection. Joe's pitchfork disrupted that link, turning the coordinated swarm into disorganized chaos. Meanwhile, at the command center, high above the battlefield, Galactic commanders watched the fight unfold on massive holographic screens. General Kale, a hardened veteran with a cybernetic arm, leaned forward, his metallic fingers tapping the table in frustration. "What's happening down there?" he demanded. "Our super soldiers are being outmaneuvered." An officer pointed to a section of the battlefield where the Xarnix lines were faltering. "Sir, there's an anomaly." Cal's eyes narrowed as he focused on the feed. At the center of the disturbance was Joe, his pitchfork glowing with an unexplainable energy. "That's the farmer," Cal muttered, his voice laced with disbelief. "What in the galaxy is he doing?" The officers exchanged nervous glances. "Sir, he's winning." Cal slammed his fist on the table. "Get me a tactical report. I want to know how a man with a pitchfork is doing what our best weapons couldn't." Back on the battlefield, the tide of the battle began to turn. Joe's presence gave the soldiers a strange kind of hope. They weren't just fighting harder, they were fighting smarter. Instead of charging blindly, they followed Joe's example, using strategy and coordination to outmaneuver the drones. At one point, a massive Xarnix warrior emerged from the swarm, its towering form bristling with energy. It let out a bone-chilling roar and charged straight for Joe. The soldiers shouted warnings, but Joe didn't move. He planted his feet firmly, his pitchfork glowing brighter than ever. As the warrior closed in, Joe raised the pitchfork high and jabbed it into the creature's core. There was a blinding flash of light, and the warrior let out a shriek that echoed across the battlefield. The energy rippling through its body exploded outward, sending nearby drones into disarray. When the light faded, the warrior was gone, reduced to a smoking heap. The battlefield fell silent as the remaining Xarnix began to retreat. Their once united front had crumbled, and their drones scattered like leaves in the wind. Joe lowered his pitchfork, his expression unreadable. Around him, the soldiers stared in awe. You just turned the whole fight around," one of them said, their voice trembling with gratitude. Joe shrugged, wiping sweat from his brow. "Ain't about how strong you are," he said. "It's about how you use what you've got." The truth about the pitchfork. The battlefield was quiet now, but the silence felt uneasy. Soldiers moved through the debris, helping the injured and regrouping after the unexpected victory. Joe Hargrove stood in the center of it all, leaning on his pitchfork. The faint glow along the tines had faded, but he could still feel its energy, a hum that pulsed faintly in his grip. Around him, whispers spread like wildfire. "Did you see what he did to that Xarnix warrior? How is a farmer with a pitchfork stronger than our tech? That weapon, it's not normal." Joe ignored the murmurs. He had never sought attention, and he wasn't about to start now. But the Galactic officers had other ideas. The interrogation. Joe found himself in a cold, sterile tent, seated across from General Cal. The room was dimly lit, with monitors showing footage of the battle replaying on a loop. Cal's cybernetic arm glinted as he tapped the table impatiently, his sharp eyes locked on Joe. "Mr. Hargrove," Cal began, his tone edged with frustration. "You just did what our best soldiers and weapons couldn't. The Xarnix retreated because of you. Now, I want to know how." Joe glanced at the pitchfork, resting on the table between them. "I'm just a farmer," he said, his voice calm. "I didn't ask to be in this fight." Cal leaned forward. "Cut the modesty. That pitchfork, what is it? Where did it come from?" Joe hesitated, his hand brushing the handle. "It's been in my family for generations. My grandfather always said it was special, but no one knew why. Just an old story about it being forged from the metal of fallen stars. I didn't think it was real until now." Cal frowned, clearly unimpressed. "Metal from fallen stars? That's not an answer. Do you have any idea what kind of power you're carrying?" Joe shrugged. "Not really. I just know it works." Cal stared at him, clearly wrestling with the absurdity of the situation. Finally, he gestured to a scientist standing nearby. "Analyze it. I want to know everything about that weapon." The scientist approached nervously, reaching for the pitchfork. But as soon as they touched it, the glow flared violently. A surge of energy knocked them back, sending them sprawling onto the floor. Joe stood quickly, grabbing the pitchfork before anyone else could. "It doesn't like strangers," he said firmly. Cal's expression darkened. "You're keeping secrets, farmer. This isn't a game. The galaxy is at stake, and we need every advantage we can get." Joe met his gaze unflinchingly. "You think throwing more tech at the Xarnics will win this war? That's the problem. You're all so focused on machines, you've forgotten how to fight." Cal opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, an alarm blared through the camp. "Sir," a soldier burst into the tent, his face pale. "The Xarnics, they're regrouping. We've detected a mothership entering orbit. A new plan." The command tent erupted into chaos. Officers scrambled to relay orders, while soldiers prepared for another wave. Cal turned to Joe, his frustration momentarily giving way to desperation. "You've proven that weapon of yours works," he said. "If the Xarnics are sending a mothership, we need you on the front lines." Joe shook his head. "Front lines won't stop them. You saw what happened out there. The Xarnics adapt too quickly. If you want to win, you need to hit the hive where it hurts." Cal frowned. "The hive mind. The queen." Joe nodded. "Take her out, and the rest fall apart." The tent fell silent. The idea was bold, suicidal, even. No one had ever gotten close enough to the hive queen to strike. But Joe's calm confidence was infectious. Cal sighed, his metal hand clenching into a fist. "Fine. We'll send a strike team. You lead the charge." Into the unknown. Joe gathered a small team. Soldiers who had seen him in action and trusted his instincts. Among them was the young woman with the cracked visor, who had fought beside him during the first battle. "Name's Kara," she said as they geared up. "If you're leading us into the belly of the beast, I'm with you." Joe gave her a faint smile. "Stick close. This won't be like anything you've seen before." The team boarded a stealth transport, its hull cloaked in adaptive camouflage. As they ascended into orbit, the mothership loomed into view, a massive organic structure pulsing with alien light. "This is it," Joe said, gripping his pitchfork. "Stay sharp. The Queen's not just strong, she's smart. She'll try to break us before we even get close." The first encounter. As the team breached the mothership's outer defenses, the Xarnics drones swarmed them immediately. But this time, Joe took the lead. His pitchfork seemed to repel the drones, disrupting their hive mind connection with every strike. "Stick together," Joe shouted. "Don't let them separate you." The soldiers followed his lead, fighting not with brute force but with precision and unity. For the first time, the Xarnics seemed disoriented, their attacks faltering as Joe's presence disrupted their rhythm. Deeper into the ship, the air grew thick with an unnatural hum. The glow from the pitchfork intensified, casting eerie shadows on the organic walls. "What's happening?" Kara whispered, her voice tight with fear. Joe's jaw tightened. "We're getting close to the Queen." The Xarnics' hive queen. The corridors of the Xarnics' mothership were unlike anything Joe Hargrove had ever seen. Organic walls pulsed faintly, as if the ship itself was alive. The air was thick with a strange energy that seemed to hum in rhythm with Joe's glowing pitchfork. Behind him, Kara and the rest of the strike team moved cautiously, their weapons ready. The deeper they went, the more erratic the Xarnics drones became. Some screeched and fled at the sight of the pitchfork, while others threw themselves at the team in a frenzy, their movements wild and disconnected. "It's like they don't know what to do," Kara whispered. "They don't," Joe said. "This thing is breaking their link." He gestured to the pitchfork, which was now glowing brighter with every step. The group rounded a corner and entered a massive chamber. The ceiling arched high above them, veined with glowing blue tendrils that pulsed like arteries. At the center of the room stood a creature unlike any they had faced before. The Hive Queen. She towered over them, her body a grotesque mix of organic and crystalline forms. Her many eyes glowed with an unnatural light, each one shifting to focus on a different member of the team. Her voice echoed in their minds, cold and calculating. "You are insignificant." The words weren't spoken aloud, but felt like daggers piercing their thoughts. One of the soldiers clutched his head and dropped to his knees, his face contorted in pain. "Stay together," Joe barked, gripping his pitchfork tightly. The Queen's gaze shifted to him, and her presence in his mind became sharper, probing. "You wield something ancient, something dangerous, but you are nothing more than a fool clinging to a broken tool." Joe stepped forward, unfazed. "We'll see about that." The Queen's wrath. The chamber erupted into chaos as the Queen unleashed her drones. They poured from the walls and ceiling, a swarm of claws and teeth. But unlike before, these drones were faster, smarter, more coordinated. Joe's team fought valiantly, forming a defensive circle. Kara's plasma rifle lit up the chamber, while others used grenades to thin the swarm. But for every drone they killed, more replaced them. Joe knew this was a losing battle. The drones were a distraction, meant to keep them busy while the Queen picked them off one by one. He could feel her presence in his mind, searching for weaknesses, trying to turn his thoughts against him. "You can't fight her head-on," Kara shouted over the din. "She's too strong." Joe didn't respond. Instead, he plunged his pitchfork into the ground. A wave of energy erupted from it, sending drones flying. The glow of the pitchfork intensified, and the Queen let out a shriek that rattled the walls. "She doesn't like that," Joe muttered, a faint smile tugging at his lips. A battle of wills. The Queen's attacks shifted. Instead of commanding her drones, she focused her energy directly on Joe. The air around him grew heavy, and his vision blurred as her voice filled his mind. "You cannot win. I am eternal. I am everything." Images flooded Joe's thoughts, visions of Earth in flames, his farm destroyed, his family's legacy wiped out. The Queen was trying to break him, to make him believe the fight was hopeless. But Joe wasn't so easily shaken. He gritted his teeth and pushed back, focusing on the pitchfork in his hands. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol of resilience, of the countless generations who had fought to survive. "You don't understand us," Joe said through clenched teeth. "You think we're weak because we don't fight like you. But humans, we don't give up. Not ever." The glow of the pitchfork flared, and the Queen screamed, recoiling as Joe took a step forward. The turning point. Kara and the team rallied around Joe, using the brief reprieve to push back the drones. But the Queen wasn't done. She lashed out with massive tendrils that burst from the walls, swiping at the soldiers and forcing them to scatter. Joe dodged a tendril that smashed into the ground where he had stood moments before. He lunged forward, driving the pitchfork into one of the glowing veins that ran through the chamber. The effect was immediate. The entire ship shuddered, and the Queen let out a guttural roar. The drones faltered, their movements becoming sluggish and disoriented. "She's connected to the ship," Joe shouted. "We take this place down, and we take her down with it." Kara nodded, her eyes fierce. "Then let's finish this." A desperate gamble. The team worked together to plant explosives along the chamber's central veins, while Joe kept the Queen distracted. She lashed out with everything she had. Mental attacks, drones, tendrils, but Joe held his ground, his pitchfork glowing like a beacon in the chaos. As the last explosive was armed, the Queen let out a deafening scream. The chamber began to collapse, and the team scrambled toward the exit. "Joe," Kara called, looking back. "We have to go." Joe hesitated. The Queen was still standing, her form flickering but unbroken. He knew if she survived, the fight would start all over again. With a deep breath, he turned back and charged toward her. "What are you doing?" Kara shouted, her voice panicked. Joe didn't answer. He leaped toward the Queen, driving the pitchfork into her core with all his strength. The chamber exploded in a blinding flash of light, and everything went silent. The farmer's stand, The detonation rocked the surface of the barren moon where the Xarnix mothership had crashed. Chunks of the organic structure crumbled and fell, its glowing veins dimming one by one. The soldiers who had escaped the collapse gathered at a safe distance, their eyes fixed on the wreckage. Kara stumbled out of the transport, coughing from the smoke and dust. Her heart pounded as she scanned the horizon, hoping for a miracle. "Joe," she shouted, her voice breaking. There was no answer. The team exchanged grim looks. The Hive Queen was gone. Her drones had collapsed, lifeless, as soon as the ship's core detonated. But the cost was clear. The farmer with the glowing pitchfork, the man who had turned the tide of an unwinnable war, was nowhere to be seen. "We have to go," one soldier said quietly, placing a hand on Kara's shoulder. "If he made it out, he'll find us. If not..." Kara shook her head. "He's not dead," she said firmly, though doubt gnawed at her resolve. Inside the hive core, beneath the rubble, in the heart of the destroyed mothership, Joe Hargrove stirred. His body ached, his vision blurred, but the faint hum of the pitchfork in his hands told him he was still alive. The chamber was barely recognizable now, reduced to a cavern of smoldering debris. The Hive Queen's massive form lay slumped in the center, her crystalline body cracked and dim. Yet, even in her defeat, a faint echo of her voice lingered in the air. "You think this is over?" the Queen whispered, her tone filled with malice. Joe staggered to his feet, his pitchfork glowing faintly. "You're finished," he said, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. The Queen's form twitched, her fractured eyes locking onto him. "You destroyed this vessel, but I am not bound by one body. My hive reaches across the stars. My death will not save your people." Joe took a step forward, raising the pitchfork. "You've already lost. Without this ship, without your drones, your hive has no way to grow. You'll die out." The Queen let out a low guttural laugh. "Perhaps, but not before I take you with me." With a final surge of energy, the Queen's core began to pulse violently, sending shockwaves through the chamber. The entire structure started collapsing further, threatening to bury Joe alive. A last stand. Joe planted his feet and raised the pitchfork high. The glow intensified, brighter than ever before, as if the weapon itself understood the stakes. The Queen's energy lashed out at him, but the pitchfork absorbed each strike, growing stronger with every attack. Joe gritted his teeth, his mind focused on one thing: ending the Hive Queen for good. "This is for my farm," he muttered, driving the pitchfork into the Queen's core. The chamber exploded with light, brighter than any star. The energy surge tore through the remnants of the ship, disintegrating the Queen's body and severing her connection to the hive once and for all. The aftermath. Hours later, as the Galactic rescue team scoured the battlefield, they found Joe. He emerged from the wreckage covered in soot and dust, the pitchfork still glowing faintly in his hands. Soldiers stopped what they were doing and stared in awe as he limped toward them. Kara ran to meet him, relief flooding her face. "You're alive," she said, her voice shaking. Joe gave her a tired smile. "Told you I wasn't done yet." The soldiers around them began to cheer, their voices echoing across the barren landscape. Joe Hargrove, the farmer with a pitchfork, had done the impossible. A hero's reward. Back at the Galactic base, Joe was brought before General Kale. The hardened commander, who had once mocked Joe's pitchfork, now looked at him with a mix of respect and disbelief. "You saved us all," Kale said. "The Xarnix threat is gone. Thanks to you. On behalf of the Galactic Council, I want to offer you..." Joe raised a hand, cutting him off. "I don't need medals or rewards," he said. "I've got a farm waiting for me back home." Kale frowned. "But surely you could." "No," Joe said firmly. "Let someone else play the hero. I'm just a farmer." The farewell. Before leaving, Kara approached Joe, a look of hesitation on her face. "Are you sure you don't want to stay?" she asked. "The galaxy could use someone like you." Joe smiled faintly. The galaxy's got enough people trying to be heroes. What it needs are folks who know how to work together. You'll do just fine without me." As Joe boarded the transport back to Earth, he glanced down at the pitchfork resting in his lap. It no longer glowed, its power seemingly dormant now that the Hive Queen was gone. But Joe knew it wasn't just the pitchfork that had made the difference. It was the willingness to fight for what mattered, no matter the odds. The aftermath. Joe Hargrove stepped off the Galactic transport and onto the dirt path leading to his farm. The familiar sights of rolling fields and weathered fences greeted him, bathed in the soft orange glow of a setting sun. The weight of the war felt like a distant memory here, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the gentle rustle of leaves. Yet, the pitchfork in his hand felt heavier than ever. He walked toward the barn, where his tools hung just as he left them. Placing the pitchfork carefully on the wall, Joe stood back and stared at it for a long moment. Its glow had faded completely, the metal now dull and unremarkable. But Joe could still feel something, an energy, a hum, deep within it. "It's over now," he said softly, as if speaking to the pitchfork itself. The legend grows. Joe's return was supposed to be quiet, like slipping into an old pair of boots. But the galaxy didn't forget him. Word of the farmer who had defeated the Xarnics spread like wildfire, carried on news broadcasts, whispered in crowded taverns, and debated in high council chambers. They called him the Farmer of the Stars, a legend who had shown that brute strength and technology weren't the only paths to victory. Songs were written, and statues commissioned on far-off planets, none of which Joe cared for. He stayed out of the limelight, refusing invitations to grand ceremonies and galactic councils. To him, the war was done, and life on the farm was all he wanted. A strange visitor. One quiet evening, as Joe repaired a fence along the edge of his field, a low hum filled the air. He looked up to see a sleek galactic shuttle descending onto the dirt road. It landed softly, the ramp lowering with a hiss. From the ship stepped a figure cloaked in dark robes, their face obscured by a hood. Joe squinted, leaning on his hammer. "Whatever you're selling," Joe called out, "I'm not buying." The figure chuckled, pulling back their hood to reveal an older woman with piercing blue eyes. Her presence was commanding, but her smile was warm. "I'm not here to sell anything," she said. "I'm here because of that." She pointed toward the barn. Joe's stomach tightened. "The pitchfork." The woman nodded. "You don't know what you're holding, do you?" Joe frowned, crossing his arms. "I know enough. It's a family heirloom, and it's done its job." The woman stepped closer, her gaze steady. "It's more than an heirloom. That weapon, if you can even call it that, is one of the few artifacts left from a forgotten era. An era when humanity wasn't just surviving in the galaxy, but shaping it." Joe's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" She gestured toward the barn. "The metal in that pitchfork isn't just from fallen stars. It's from something much older, something tied to the origins of humanity itself. It's why it could disrupt the Xarnics. Their hive mind wasn't just technology. It was ancient, tied to the same energy." Joe shook his head, stepping back. "I'm just a farmer. I don't want anything to do with this." The woman sighed. "You might not want it, but the galaxy isn't done with you, Joe Hargrove. That pitchfork is a key, and there are doors left to open." The glow returns. That night, Joe sat on his porch, the pitchfork leaning against the wall beside him. He stared out at the fields, his thoughts a whirlwind of questions. "Why me?" he muttered. As if in answer, the pitchfork began to glow faintly. The same hum that had accompanied him in the war returned, softer this time, almost comforting. Joe reached out and ran his hand along the tines. The glow intensified for a moment before settling into a steady pulse. Joe sighed. "Looks like you're not done, huh?" A new purpose. Over the following weeks, visitors began arriving at Joe's farm. Some were soldiers looking for guidance, inspired by his story. Others were scholars and scientists, hoping to study the pitchfork's energy. Joe turned most of them away, preferring the quiet life he had fought so hard to protect. But one day, Kara arrived, her uniform replaced with simple clothes and a hopeful smile. "You can't hide forever," she said, sitting on the porch beside him. "The galaxy still needs you." Joe chuckled, shaking his head. "The galaxy's got plenty of heroes now. They don't need a farmer." Kara nudged him playfully. "Maybe they don't need a farmer, but they might need you." Joe glanced at the pitchfork, its faint glow reflecting in his tired eyes. Deep down, he knew Kara was right. The Xarnics might be gone, but the galaxy was vast, and dangers were always lurking. The farmer's journey. A week later, the farm was quiet again. Joe stood in the barn, his old tools hanging neatly on the walls. He strapped the pitchfork to his back, its glow a steady reminder of the journey ahead. As he stepped outside, Kara waited by a small ship, her arms crossed and a grin on her face. "Ready?" Joe took one last look at the farm before nodding. "Guess it's time to see what's out there." The ship's engines roared to life, and as it ascended into the starry sky, the faint hum of the pitchfork echoed in Joe's ears. He didn't know where the path would lead, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to follow it.